Example builds on example 2 with a couple of differences. So those differences are that we're using the Gateway API. We're actually using Istio as our implementation. And the other difference is we're using OCM, or Open Cluster Management, to place our gateway and HttpRoute and other application resources into each cluster on the west and east one. We still have Skupper router set up on either cluster under the Skupper link. I've gone ahead and created these resources in either cluster via the ManifestWork resource or ManifestWork API that OCM provides. I'll show you what they look like. But these initial set of steps here, I've gone ahead and done this. So let's have a look. We'll be able to send some HTTP traffic to either cluster directly and just show that we're getting a response before we start to do some stuff with Skupper. So the gateway resource, if we have a look at the one for the West cluster, so this is encapsulated in the ManifestWork, and the gateway is here. The name is Istio. That's going into our West namespace, and we're specifying the gateway class name is Istio. We have one listener set up here, and this is the host name for our app in the West cluster. So there's a service load balancer. It has this IP address, so we're just using the host name with nip.io. The gateway for the East cluster looks very similar, just a couple of differences here, going to East namespace, and the host name has a slightly different IP address at the start there. The application that we're pushing into either cluster, let's have a look at that. So again, encapsulated in a ManifestWork because we're using OCM to push it down. We have our service in here going into West cluster. We have our deployment, and we have our HttpRoute this time instead of an ingress. So we have the host name here matching the listener in the gateway. We're referencing the gateway itself here, and we have a backend ref pointing to the service, which is defined up at the top of the ManifestWork here. So three manifests here in this ManifestWork that are pushed into the cluster, and the same for the East cluster as well, with the differences on the namespace and the host name down here. So they're all in the cluster. So let's curl either one directly and just see what the response looks like. So if we have a look at the first one, the West cluster, the request is served by this particular host name, or sorry, this particular pod name. So it begins with LF. If we scroll down to our second one, it begins with L6. Another thing to note here, we have some response headers coming back from Istio, from Envoy. If we see this one here, it gives us the service name. So echo.west. Down here we have echo.east. So like in example 2, we're going to expose the services in both directions with Skupper. Then we're going to take the pod on the East cluster down and just show that the resiliency feature works with gateways and HttpRoutes as well. So let's update the Skupper cluster policy to allow us to do that. And then we'll expose that service in both directions. We're going to scale down the app pod in the East cluster. Now, previously, we would have just used the kubectl scale command. But if we do that here, OCM will eventually, via the ManifestWork, it'll eventually set that back to whatever is in the ManifestWork. So what we're going to do here is modify the ManifestWork instead. Let me give that a refresh. I think we have the latest commands here. Yeah, so let's target our hub cluster and let's modify that ManifestWork. So this is the ManifestWork for the East cluster. Let's look for replicas. So this is the, you can see here, this is the deployment. Let's go down to replicas and say 0. So OCM will go ahead and push that change down for the deployment. Let's have a closer look at that in the East cluster. We can see here that our echo deployment is now scaled down to 0. So what happens now if we curl the app in either cluster? So let's do that. So the first cluster, you're getting a response from the LF pod, and then the second one, we're also getting a response from the LF pod. It does say here though that the service that's being used is still the East service, and that makes sense because Skupper is it's not creating a new service, it's modifying the existing service to route or proxy the requests over the Skupper link to the Skupper router on the west side.